In today's episode of AI Culture, Matthew Hill discusses his journey learning data science. He explains how to become a data scientist for anyone with a social science or other non-mathematical background, and how to navigate the common pitfalls of learning these skills on your own. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Matthew Hill. Matthew, how are you doing today?
Fine, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah,
Nice to connect with you.
yeah, it is cool to connect. So you are an anthropologist, and honestly, a little like me, you've been learning and taking a dip into data science. But I think, I've been studying it since university. Like I studied math, I've studied things related to it. I've been programming long before the word data scientist was a thing, but it seems like you've kind of been slowly reinventing yourself as both an anthropologist and a data scientist, and kind of rediscovering new things in the process. So let's talk about that. I guess I'll start very abstract. What's it been like?
It's been let me just say this: it's been a journey. I think we're living in this moment when there's so much interest in big data right now with the rise of generative AI and large language models. There's increasing access to data. I think it's an exciting moment, and for anthropologists in particular, who have been somewhat constrained by our qualitative methods, small sample sizes, deep analysis, but given the types of data that are available to us, textual data, and some of these tools that we can use to analyze data at scale, I think there's a lot more interest right now in trying to think about how we can use computational approaches to analyze qualitative data. So that's what's been exciting for me in any event. Feeling like, hey, I want to understand more about what's going on. I don't want to just interact with a chatbot. I want to try to get inside the black box, so to speak, and try to understand a little bit more what data scientists are doing and how they do it. See how I can apply that in my own practice.
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think which path I want to take first. Let's jump into the Let's jump into the why side first. What made you want to do this? And then we'll talk about how you did it in a bit, and what your process has been like and where you're at now.
Right. Well, I think a couple of things. One is just this feeling of being irked that I wasn't strong enough on the quantitative side as somebody trained as a cultural anthropologist, doing a lot of qualitative research and traditional ethnography as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and having worked some in the user experience research world, human-centered design, having worked as a design anthropologist, and then having worked as an organizational anthropologist, doing things like organizational diagnoses, but relying primarily on interviews and focus groups and participant observation, but nevertheless wanting to be able to use more quantitative approaches and always feeling like an outsider. I'm feeling frustrated that I didn't have that training as a graduate student. And so I think that's what pushed me finally to, I'd taken some courses. I was at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for about 7 years. And while I was there, I did take some short courses and things like R and SPSS and so forth, but never really used it that much. And so didn't get to the level of basic proficiency that you would need to use these tools in research. So I think that was the impetus, just wanting to develop some basic fluency, and then I guess the other thing was the rise of AI, generative AI, that is, in some of these tools, and really wanting to get under the hood, so to speak. So I think that's what prompted me.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I mean, what this reminds me of, I remember back when I was in grad school, I remember I looked at like a survey project that my department did. My anthropology, this is grad school in anthropology. So the anthropology department did a survey where they asked people, alumni of the program, kind of looking backwards, and asked them like, what were some of the biggest things whole list of survey questions, but I'm gonna focus on one, which was, what were some of the biggest things you felt like when you entered the professional world, when you graduated, that you felt like skills you needed that you felt like you didn't get from the program? And the number one answer was like statistics and quantitative thinking. This was really before, data science. Maybe now they would be saying like AI and machine learning or something like that. Um,
Right.
but it seems like you also felt that lack, and decided to try to figure it out. I guess, what was your process like trying
Yeah.
to learn this? It seems like you've been taking a
Yeah.
bunch of courses that you found for free. But yeah, what has this process been like?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I took a couple of short courses. A lot of universities they'll offer workshops and things like that for graduate students who need these quantitative methods to do research projects. So at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, they had something called ISSR, the Institute for Social Science Research, and they offered, as I mentioned, a lot of short courses. I took courses in R. I took a course on text as data with this political scientist named Douglas Rice, which was just phenomenal. But again, I hadn't really used these tools very much in actual research, and we moved to my partner and I moved to New York City a couple of years ago, and we just happened to live virtually right next door to City College of New York in West Harlem. Um, and so, I'd been here for just a couple of months and started looking through the course catalog, and saw that in mathematics they were teaching this course on applied statistics, and I thought, okay, let me sign up for that. So I just took this course, and it was actually taught in Python. And it was my first introduction to Python. By the way, I wanted to mention a phenomenal textbook and series of lectures that we use in that course. It's by this guy, Gareth James, and a number of co-authors. It's free, it's available online, and the text is called An Introduction to Statistical Learning. And there's two versions of it. One is Introduction to Statistical Learning with applications in Python, and then there's another version with applications in R. And it's just a wonderful introduction to basic statistical learning techniques. It has labs, but gets into linear regression, logistic regression, classification, and so forth. Even getting into machine learning, supervised and unsupervised machine learning techniques. And there's a whole series of YouTube videos that were produced by the authors in conjunction with Stanford University. So I highly recommend that resource. And so in the way the course was taught, it was taught like a capstone. So we had these basically lectures. We were going through the text, doing these techniques using Google Colab. At the time, Google Colab is also a very wonderful tool for working in Python, learning Python as a kind of an introductory stage. And so the course was taught as a capstone, and we just basically said, find a project, find some data. And so at the time I'd been having some conversations with this person who was working with Bloomberg Philanthropies and doing some work on housing vacancy in Baltimore. So I got really interested in that. I was trying to figure out, okay, what kind of data can I get on vacant housing, and what kind of models could I potentially use using Python? Could I develop a predictive model using Python to predict what kind of property was in jeopardy of becoming vacant? Ideally so that the city could design some type of interventions around that sort of thing. So, so that's how I got started. It was like there was this tool, Python. There was data. Baltimore and a number of cities. New York City is incredible in this regard, but New York City has this whole open data portal, and you can find all kinds of data sets. And so it's it's just, yeah, it's great. Unlike ethnography and so forth, where you have to go out and create your data, so to speak, through interviews or observations and field notes. Here's just all of this readily available data for you. So that's kind of how I got into it. Using Python to try to solve this problem of housing vacancy, and using a lot of different data sets to try to figure out, was it about proximity to the city center? Was it about brownfields? Was it about, socioeconomic status? These various factors that I was using to try to develop this model to predict, come up with some kind of prediction of, housing that was vulnerable to vacancy, which has a big impact on the city, because then those properties are the vacant properties, people aren't paying property taxes, and that becomes a big burden on the city. So that's basically how I got into it.
Yeah, this is really cool. I mean, I'm glad. I guess I'm glad you did get into it, and I think like you, in my personal experience, most people get into it by having a problem. Like I feel like data science, maybe like programming based skills or activities in general, are often best to learn with a problem. And then you kind of learn in the context of that problem. You try to figure out, okay, how can I learn about this better? How can I learn about this data set or this question or about this society better? And then kind of build the tools based off of that. I find, for at least, there's many different learners out there, but most people with this skill set learn it best in the context of a problem.
Right.
Just like, even if I was to tell someone, like, if someone's like, I want to learn Photoshop, I'd be like, great, let's open up a picture here. How do you, remove this person from your wedding photo or whatever? Give them a problem, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree with you. Yeah.
The so do you think over time your problem, the types of problems you solved, evolved, and maybe for, like, in these problems, like, it seems like these, your research involves thinking about a lot of social questions. It seems like there's both quantitative and qualitative almost aspects to the problem. How did you kind of approach that, or kind of evolve over time and incorporate these different ways of thinking together?
Yeah, that's a good question. At this point, I would say most of the work I've been doing is more quantitative, although, well, I can talk about another project that I've been working on. But I think getting into the questions about how to integrate qualitative and quantitative are important. And so maybe we can talk more about that. But I think, in general, what I'm finding is that quantitative data is really good at answering the what, so to speak, and qualitative is good at answering the why. So I think that there's a nice marriage between those two things, potentially. But I also do agree on what you were saying about, like, finding a problem to work on, because that was for me one of the challenges that I had in taking these short courses when I was at UMass Amherst, is that I would take a course, but then I wouldn't really apply what I had learned. So I wasn't really getting deeper into it. It's a little bit like language learning, where you can take a course in a language, but unless you really go live in a place or go do field work or you're forced to use the language on a daily basis, you don't really develop that fluency. You need to get to that basic level where you can have a rudimentary conversation, and then once you have that with a language, like if you're living in a country, um, then you can just really start to deepen your language, right? Skills, because you can ask people, well, how do you say this? Or how do you say that? And just engaging in conversation, you're immersed in the milieu. And I would say it's very much the same. It's been the same for me, working on with the data science or quantitative skills. It's, again, just getting involved in a project. So after I took that one course at City College, I started looking around for a more kind of rigorous training, I guess you could say. And I discovered that I'd been exploring some programs at Columbia, which were quite expensive. But then CUNY at the Graduate Center, they had this program in quantitative methods in the social sciences. And it's fairly affordable. You can take a course for like $1,500 or something like that. And semester long courses. So I ended up signing up for that program and just started taking courses there, just in part because I enjoy learning with other people. It's more social, and there's just the structure of a semester long course with a professor and projects and assignments and so forth. It just helps me learn. And the great thing about the Graduate Center and these professional programs is all the courses are taught in the evening, so 6 to 8 kind of thing. So they really do accommodate a working professional. So I started after my initial course in Python. I signed up for this quantitative methods program at the Graduate Center and started taking. I took a course in just quantitative methods. Everything was taught in R at that point in time, which I think we talked about. For me, is like a sister language to Python. I think of them as like French and Spanish. Basically, you're doing the same thing, the same functions. R is maybe a little bit more used by academics doing statistical work, whereas I think Python is used a little bit more in industry, in straight data science skills. We could talk more about that, but so I started just learning sort of basic quantitative methods, using R, learning things like how to do data visualization, learning about functions and loops, and just essentially how to do basic programming in R. And the thing that's really cool about R or Python is that you can write a fairly basic piece of code, and then you produce something. You produce a bar chart, you produce a histogram or a cluster diagram. And yeah, like there's this thing called ggplot that you use in R to create these visualizations. And what's very powerful about it, as opposed to like SPSS or Stata or SAS, which are more kind of point and click type programs, is that there's an element of creativity. It's like learning to play the guitar, or there are different ways, chords, patterns you can learn, and you can produce something out of that, which is like music. And so that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about both R and Python, is just the freedom to learn these techniques, and then to be able to take data sets and analyze them and produce visualization that help you understand some of the patterns in this data, without having to run around and do a whole lot of field work as well in interviews. So those are a couple of things. Let me just stop there and see if that resonates in any way with your experience learning Python and so forth.
Yeah, no, a lot of this I agree with so much of what you're saying. So first of all, I want to say at the top that I really like your analogy of Python and R as Spanish versus French.
Mm.
I wanted to something there was a specific point that I wanted to tease out a little more of what you're saying.
Sure.
So I really like your point that like when people first learn Python, I mean, sorry, when people first learn data science or Python, for that matter, there comes a point where they start to develop the ability to kind of figure it out to figure it out, and then that
Right.
kind of catalyzes further learning. And your metaphor was, like when you're learning a language, when you first get to the point where you can like ask people, what is this? What is this? You start to steamroll and you start to learn lot more, a lot faster.
Right. Yeah.
One quick side, but as we're doing this recording, I'm currently in Indonesia, and after being here for a couple weeks, it was like a week or two ago, I hit that point and I could finally like confidently and pretty fluently ask people, what is this? What is the word for this? What is why do you say that, like what do you mean, and like questions like this that kind of got people talking more. And then my language ability with Indonesian went from like a couple words to like 100 in the matter of a couple days. So I hit that point, so
Yeah.
I very much can relate to that metaphor. And then ironically, I bet whenever I leave this country I'll probably forget almost all of it, but that's okay. But like, um, maybe not. Maybe my Indonesian friends will force me to remember. But anyway, so I guess my question for you is someone, and we'll say the hypothetical person is like an anthropologist or a social scientist. Somebody is trying to learn data science and they're not really at that point. Like, what should they do? What can they learn? What should they do first to get to that point where they can start to kind of catalyze their own learning?
Yeah. Again, I think signing up for a course where where you have some structured,
Oh,
you know,
and real quick,
in a,
I'm sorry. One other
please,
thing,
please.
one other question within that, just to incorporate into your answer. I forgot to say this. What do you think are some of the skills that are necessary to learn to get to that self-starting phase too? If you
Yeah.
could incorporate that into the answer too. Keep going. We're talking about
Sure,
taking a
sure,
course.
sure. I mean, in terms of math, I think, the math in most data science is not really that complicated. I think it's just basic like algebra, to be honest with you, linear algebra. So, not to say that, a lot of us haven't forgotten our algebra or are a little bit rusty on it, but, I don't find the mathematics all that difficult. It is helpful to take some statistics. So, as part of my training at the CUNY Graduate Center, the core courses that you take there are in like this course in quantitative methods, which again is taught in R. Basically, they're just teaching you, how to use R, how to use, um, you know, uh, how to create visualizations with this thing called ggplot, how to do basic math in R, how to create what they call functions, which is just basically a way of writing code so that, you can get the code to sort of go on auto repeat, so to speak. And, um, you know, uh, how to use different tools. There's this thing called R Markdown, which is very helpful for producing reports and so forth with your code. And so, and so just getting a basic learning about vectors and things like that, just getting a basic familiarity with this language, having some assignments around it. I find that kind of structure to be very helpful. And then, in the context of these courses I've been taking, there's always some kind of a final project, find a data set, meet with your professor, do something with the data, analyze it in some way using some of the tools that we've had in our course. And so, um, I think that's a way to kind of get involved in a project in a very structured way. So, and I know a lot of people, say take a course in Coursera Stanford has some great courses as well that are online, but I just find that I learn best with a group of people where we're all doing it together. It becomes more social and fun. As opposed to doing everything in isolation. So that worked really well for me. And then also of the other cool courses that I've taken at the Graduate Center have just been two courses of statistics 1 and statistics 2. And it's being taught by a sociologist, and statistics 2, you're just getting into different types of regression and so forth. But again, there are assignments, there are projects that you have to work on. So I've used that as a way to kind of get into, doing the assignments itself is a way, I think, to start practicing and finding some data sets and so forth. So, and I could talk a little bit more about the projects that I've been working on, but let me just stop there for a minute.
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense, and I absolutely agree with you. I think taking a course is helpful especially for providing that initial foundation. In my experience as someone who former teacher and someone who's coached a lot of people through data science is that, well, one, there's a lot of different learners out there. Some people on the one extreme really benefit from the structure in the entire process. And then on the other end of the extreme, there are some people who are very independent learners who can just completely learn on their own and be okay. But my experience is that second type is a bit more of the exception rather than the standard. Like there are a lower percentage of learners. If that's you, anyone who's listening, good for you. Go learn that way. That's fantastic. But that's not the majority of people. And most people, especially at the beginning, a course provides a structure to help them circumvent that feedback loop of, I don't know anything, so how do I get started? And it can give people enough to get started so then they can eventually learn on their own, if they would desire. In my opinion, personally, I would say that, or my experience, 2 important skills to develop in the beginning that kind of help you learn on your own so that you can kind of catalyze your own learning is, and we don't think of these as skills, but they are skills. The first is to be able to listen to a potential data science problem and both figure out its scope or break it down, or figure out what aspect of this problem is doable from a data science perspective. And in terms of what kind of data you have. This is a very important skill in data science. And until one develops this skill, it's a bit harder to figure out how, is this a good project to do? So like we both talked about, or what you said before, it's good to have a project. But one of the problems is that figuring out what the right type of project to do is a skill in and of itself. And if one doesn't develop that skill, then it's hard to come up with a project, and then you're kind of stuck. And I think for that, like a course, and there, like you said, there's a bunch of free online courses help jumpstart that, because they'll give you some of those initial projects that allow you to start to think that way, think about that. And then the other is the ability, say in like something like Python or R, to know enough to be able to look up how to solve your problem. So like now, if I'm trying to do something in Python and I need to look up some obscure aspect of Pandas documentation to figure out how to do this specific thing I'm doing, because I don't have everything memorized that's possible to do, I can Google it. But I know the language in this field to know how to like search in a way that brings it up quickly.
Right.
But when I first started, I wouldn't know how to do that. I might spend really a half hour to an hour figuring out like how do I even phrase the problem in a way that the things that come up are related and not a completely
Right.
different thing. And that's
Right.
also something that like a teacher in a course or even, like your random friend who's a data scientist, if you text them, they can help you with that. And they can say, this is how this is how we
Right.
phrase it, yada, 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 and can help
Right.
build that skill. And that skill, once you've built that, people can kind of self start because they can start to look up how to do their own things. Just
Right.
like in your analogy, the skill of being able to ask, what is this in that new
Right.
language allows you
Right.
to start to learn new things more quickly. Or what are your
Right.
thoughts?
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think I'm still in that phase of learning like what kinds of things I'm having more confidence now, but what kinds of problems can I solve with these tools? and even what kinds of questions can I ask? I mean, I remember when I did field work, I did field work for a couple of years in Cuba, and we hadn't really been taught too much in the way of field research techniques before I went and did my field research. And there was that whole process of figuring out, okay, how do you do this? What questions do you ask? How do you do participant observation? How do you synthesize the data to something meaningful? How do you find patterns? And it's a similar thing with data science. I think, what kinds of questions can you ask? What kinds of problems can you solve? What types of data do you need to do that? What kinds of packages do you need to use and so forth. So I guess that's coming back to the language learning analogy. That part of that is like becoming more fluent in the language and in the methods as well. And so I'll just say, like, I was fortunate in that I got involved in apart from these courses that I was taking and structured, assignments and problem sets and having that mentorship of a professor, a sociologist in my case, at the graduate center who had been the chair of the department and done a lot of publication. I got involved in a couple of different projects. So before I moved to New York City, I had been involved in this integrated administrative data initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, where they were doing a lot of work with large administrative data sets from like health and human services or social welfare, or education data, foster care, integrating this data and using it to do different types of analyses for policy innovation and program reform. And so from that time that I had working with that initiative, I knew this little policy group in New York City that's in the office of the mayor. And so I got plugged into them through my connection and just said, hey, looking for, I know Python, they only worked in R. And so I knew Python at the time, a little bit of Python. So anyway, they took me on and they just gave me a project to work on. So I was working in a small shop with like seven or eight other data scientists, research scientists, and in this case they had these large Medicaid data sets that they had integrated with other data on homeless shelter use and women that maternal motherhood types of issues. And so they kind of gave me this integrated data set, actually integrate myself, integrate kind of, and just basically wanted me to try to understand something about mental health conditions that people that had shelter exposure within this Medicaid data set had. Like, what was the difference between their mental health conditions, people that had shelter exposure versus people within the Medicaid data set who didn't have that. So it was kind of an interesting thing. Like, I had to start out with these things called ICD-10 codes, which are used by Medicaid to give different types of diagnoses. And within there's like these mental health diagnoses, and basically come up with a way of kind of classifying these mental health conditions in a set of like basic codes that I could then use to query this large integrated Medicaid data set to try to understand these patterns. So I was doing that in R and so forth, and developing these charts and graphs and so forth to again see these discrepancies between these different populations. So that was like an initial project that I worked on, again with a lot of mentorship and tutelage from other data scientists. So I was fortunate in that respect, but I would say, if there's, apart from the assignments, I think kind of getting involved in a project like that is extremely helpful. Maybe you can talk about your experience tutoring people, like how you've helped them get connected up with data science projects that they can work on, because I do think that's a preliminary way to kind of get into the field. So
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense, and I do want to also ask you about like how you know what, I'll ask that question in a little bit, but
good.
um to give me a second because I'm kind of formulating my thoughts on how I would uh, explain my process. I will say that connecting people with a project, um, I tend to see a good data science project is actually a fairly internal thing. People, different individuals have different experiences, but in general, sorry, different individuals have different motivations, also different experiences. But that's what I meant to say. Different motivations, but in general, I find people are more motivated by um a data science project that they already have a passion for.
Mhm.
Um, and they're more likely to see it through. Especially during the inevitable phases of learning when they're just kind of feel stuck and frustrated. This is a very common, basically a standard part of an initial data science project, to
Mhm.
feel that way. Um, so the two forms of it is I'll ask people like, what are you interested in? And then try to see if we can figure out based off of that what a good data science project is. And there are two forms of it. One is like a passion project of theirs, and the other is something they're thinking like a problem that they're thinking about at work. Maybe if they're already like a qualitative researcher that they're doing some kind of research on already, that they can also incorporate and include some kind of uh, data science aspect. I find that um, either of those tend to motivate people, and
Mhm.
allow them to see through the project. The first, their passion project, is a purely internal well, it might not be purely, but it's a primarily internal motivator. It's something that they just love, and so they're interested in it because of that. The second is a little more of an external motivation. They might be interested in that project because they are already thinking about it for their job, or if they're a grad student for their research project, for their thesis, whatever the case may be, whatever their work is that they're thinking about for their work. So including it into that then allows them to keep will hopefully keep them motivated. And I think internal motivation is generally ideal for most people. Some people are more motivated externally, but the internal motivation doesn't always work for a data science project, depending on the individual. So sometimes you go with the job one.
Right.
The advantage of the job is that, like, most people I talk to who are trying to learn data science are trying to learn data science because they want a new job as a data scientist. They want to be transition to a data scientist, or they want to incorporate a data science into their current role. So they either
Right.
want a new role that is a data scientist, or they want to turn their role more into a data science role. And either goal, um, adding data science to being able to say, "Hey, I did this data science project as part of my job," boost their resume and boost their ability to do that, to meet that goal.
Right.
So that's the type of motivation there. Um, but and also an advantage of a lot of the kind of the work based job project ideas is that work often has data, so it's a bit easier for them to find data
Right.
if it's a work based project. Whereas some passion projects, we have to be like, well, this is really cool, but there may not be good publicly accessible data on this that you could use.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that's typically how I approach it. What do you think?
No, I think that's really good. Um, the passion project, because that carries you through that zone of liminality. In previous conversations, we've talked about there's this wonderful book by Henrietta Ibarra called Working Identities, and she talks about people making career transitions, like you were talking about, from maybe moving more into the data science space. And she talks about how it's a kind of a liminal process, which is something that anthropologists can relate to, where you're sort of leaving one community of friends and developing new friends in the process. And that can feel uh, very anxiety producing. And so um, I do think having that passion does help pull us through, and it kind of keeps us on track and so forth. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. Um, I was going to mention that. So I got involved in a second. I started doing that one project with the policy group, working with the integrated administrative data in the city of New York. But then there was a hackathon that was organized by the School of Public Health at Columbia in the fall that I went to, and it was called the Narrative to Numbers Hackathon. And the idea was to try to use qualitative data at scale to develop uh, solutions to a variety of different public health risks related to climate change. They actually had some funding from the Center for Disease Control, CDC, to try to do this, preparedness work within the city of New York. But in any event, the focus of the hackathon was using qualitative data at scale to address a variety of different public health risks. So I went to this hackathon with my, a little bit of Python and my budding R skills, and joined up with a team. Um, and we ended up working on a project. So you have basically like 8 hours to develop this project, to figure out what data set you're going to use. It was very structured and so forth. There were 10 different type of hazards, and we had to choose like one hazard. So we ended up choosing extreme heat as the hazard we were going to focus on. And we had like a social geographer, a person from the Department of Health in the city on our team, and a couple of undergraduates. And so we ended up coming up with this idea to use social media data to try to develop this index to see like where are people tweeting about extreme heat in the city, let's say in the context of heat waves, and how did that differ from quantitatively measured heat in the city. So the Department of Health has this thing called the Heat Vulnerability Index, and they've sort of mapped where the hot and cold zones are in the city. And we thought, well, let's try to really get inside the experience, the actual experience of people living with heat exposure, whether it's in aging buildings, lacking air conditioner, or due to a lack of tree canopy, and see if we can find some kind of a signal that we can use to describe the actual experience. So it kind of aligned with our interests as anthropologists and the emic, as opposed to the edic dimensions of experience, get inside the felt or the understood, experienced heat, and then also, but also kind of doing this at scale, working with qualitative data. So that was our original idea, and we ended up winning the hackathon, our concept. But post hackathon, I've continued to work on that project for 6 months. The project's expanded, and now it's involved some faculty from the CUNY School of Public Health and so forth. But we ran into some roadblocks with social media data. At post 2023, it's gotten much harder to work with social media data, geocoded social media data. Since the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, they've really shut down the API. So we ended up moving from social media data to 311 data, which again, you can get access to both 311 and 911 data in New York City. So it's this other kind of really rich descriptive data set. And we started looking at this to see, okay, during heat wave days, what kinds of things are people complaining about in the different boroughs of New York City? And it turned out that people were complaining about things like fire hydrants, like illegal fire hydrant openings, fire hydrants running. There were also complaints about things like power outages and ventilation issues. And so we began to realize that that these different complaint types were descriptive signals of different behaviors that people were engaging in the city to try to mitigate their exposure to extreme heat. And we began to map this spatially and integrate our analysis with some socio-demographic data. And we realized that, for instance, around these fire hydrant complaints, that they were very concentrated in the South Bronx, in northern Manhattan. So kind of West Harlem, Washington Heights, predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, older housing stock, areas with lots of low tree canopy, lots of high CO2 levels due to a lot of highway infrastructure, which of course is dumped in the poorest neighborhoods and so forth. So that's what I've been kind of working with this team now for 6 months on that project. And I think what's cool there is, again, working with a team. So you're learning again from other data scientists, geographers, public health officials, environmental scientists. And that's when it starts to get really cool. Like the stuff you've learned in the classroom about t-tests or, about regression and so forth. Now you're starting to apply, in an urban context, and you're saying, oh my God, yeah. It begins to really make sense when you start seeing correlations between heat waves and fire hydrant usage and, so on and so forth. So that's been a very cool and ongoing project, and we're actually working on a dashboard right now where the city could, in theory, use this 311 data to supplement this other heat vulnerability index map they have in real time, and to try and understand, where is extreme heat happening in the city, and then try to direct resources and so forth towards those areas and populations.
Yeah, this is really cool. I mean, um, it's a really cool project, and I do have to admit, like I've also modeled uh like heat maps and almost access to coolness in like big cities. And one of my projects was in Mexico City, and then it gives an appreciation for well, that's another like New York City size city. I think it's actually
Right.
technically a little larger, but about the same size. but like, um, and it's a fascinating topic. One a follow-up question I have on this, and you can answer for this project, or if there's another project that also might hint at this, feel free to bring it up as well. But um, you were talking about this before. You were talking about how you've been developing the ability to kind of think through a problem and think through how to turn it into a data science problem and how to turn it into a doable data science problem. Um, you've been doing that also as an anthropologist, where anthropologists also need to take like a big question or problem about society, something that they're wondering about, and turn it into a an ethnographic or a qualitative research project that they can now do. Um, how do you think the process is similar or different doing it in the data science or quantitative world versus doing it in the more qualitative form of social science?
Right, right. Well, coming back to this heat vulnerability project, um, where there's some overlap, I would say, between the data science and a more traditional ethnographic project is that we were really trying to get inside of the felt experience
Mm-hmm.
of heat vulnerability in the city. Um, and initially, we were trying to get at that through um, social media data, which is language, basically, right, at scale. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so this comes back to like using some text as data techniques, and packages like Quantita, for instance, and R that you can use to tokenize large data sets and then to begin to look for patterns in large qualitative data sets. Um, and I think that that's one overlap. I mean, we ended up moving to the 311 data, but even the 311 data, when you have people interacting with like 311 operator, and so there's some data input and so forth, and there are some standardized fields and so forth that people are using, but still you get you get a little bit of a sense of what's going on at a behavioral level, by the types of complaints people are making on certain days in certain areas of the city. So you do get like a pulse on like what's happening at a behavioral level, and you can do that across a city of 8 million people, right? which is hard to do if you're just doing a little field study, even if you're doing a multi-site field study. um, and so, some potential follow-ons from this is like, okay, so there's a lot of activity around hydrants, right? People are obviously using hydrants for cooling and so forth, but why are they using the hydrants for cooling? That's very difficult to understand, working with the large data set and kind of at the macro level we're working at. So then I think that becomes an interesting place for interviews and observations to try and start talking to people in community groups and understand, why are people using fire hydrants? Is it they don't have access to AC? Is it that there are no swimming pools? Is it there are, the cooling centers are closed, or is it just, is this like cultural activity that people are engaging in? It's, fun to tap into a fire hydrant, legally and so forth. Um, so, I do think the two work hand in hand like that. And actually, we've been working now with some people from the School of Public Health. This one woman who does a professor there who does a lot of work around migrant labor, migrant laborers who maybe don't have English as a first language, who are doing construction trades and so forth on hot days, and how knowledgeable they about their own heat exposure, and what are the best ways to communicate with them about the risks of heat and how to stay cool and so forth. And so they've been experimenting with. They're planning on experimenting once we've kind of moved beyond this phase with different ways of messaging to these communities who may be informal workers and so forth. about heat exposure and how to protect themselves, whether that's through WhatsApp and so forth. Um, I think you can, begin to move into different communities, more fine-grained types of analysis. Um, you know, I think it helps to have the macro and the micro. So much of anthropology is always about integrating the micro and the macro, um, you know, to enhance the quality of our explanations.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I really, really like this, and I really, really like your point that um where you're like this the kind of text-based quantitative analysis that you did, where you're like, well, this is really very similar to text to speech, and you're really just trying to understand speech at scale, um, or I guess at a bigger macro scale. I really like that point. I think that, like in my personal experience, actually a lot of the I'll focus on the text-based analysis. There's a lot of forms of kind of the data science text-based analysis, which is, in my view, really looks very similar to qualitative coding.
Mm.
Like any anthropologist probably has had to do for their interviews a bunch. I remember, in grad school, this is like one of the things you have to do a lot. Uh, that it's very similar. I really like that point. I think there's a lot of, especially in the text world, there's a lot of forms of analysis that are really um, similar to qualitative coding at a bigger scale. And I think some forms of data science and machine learning, that idea can apply to other types of things too. So like there are other types of analysis that I will actually see a broad core similarity um, to various qualitative approaches, but they're done at a much bigger scale. Um,
Mm.
and all right, so uh, uh, I guess one final question I have for you is, um, for anyone on the social science side who's listening to this and who is like, who wants to become a data scientist, and or develop these skills, um, what would you recommend they do as their first steps? Like, what can they do tomorrow to kind of get the show on the road for that, to kind of
Mm.
get in that direction?
Yeah, again, I think we talked about this earlier. I would say get involved in some kind of structured learning program. Whether that's an online course, but for me, always some kind of more structured learning with other people works better. Whether it's through a community college or just find some kind of an affordable evening course, for instance, that you can take. Can be online. I like in person if you can find that. Because it just becomes more fun if you're going through the process with other people, um, and it becomes contagious in that respect. Yeah, and then I think we talked about finding a project, whether that's at work or whether you talked about a passion project. But again, I think that mentorship is important early on. Just think about us doing fieldwork projects early on as graduate students. We had faculty advisors and so forth, who could mentor us. And so I'd say just, get involved in some kind of structured learning. Um, you know, I did want to mention one very fun book also by, it's this guy named David Spiegelhalter. It's called The Art of Statistics. It's just a wonderful introductory book written at a very popular level with very little math required, and it's an easy read. And I actually found it on a list of data science resources on GitHub. So that's in addition to the volume by Gareth Jones that I mentioned. on the introduction to statistical learning. I think that's also a nice resource. So I think those would be my main two suggestions. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, I absolutely agree. I think like I think getting enrolled in a free course. Actually, what I tell people to do first, before a data science course proper, is to learn Python or learn R, so that they
Mm.
can kind of practice programming, because programming is a good free litmus test before people
Yeah,
pay any money.
yeah,
And there are free data science courses, but like I wouldn't recommend someone go spend like $1,000 on a course until they've tried the activity. And I find for many of the data science courses proper, especially the more expensive ones, they require programming anyway. So just go learn a programming
right.
language and see how that feels.
Yeah,
If it does
yeah,
not feel good, then you're not going to like data science.
yeah,
And you haven't spent any money to learn
yeah.
that.
I, yeah, I did want to mention one other thing you just made me think of. Another great resource is Data Camp. Um, it's very affordable. Actually, when I was signed up for my course at CUNY, we got free access to Data Camp. And just if you take their introductory course, whether it's an introductory course in R or introductory course in Python, it's like, just really simple, basic kind of structured learning with simple tests and so forth. It's like some of these language learning programs, like Duolingo almost, only for R and Python. And I wish somebody had told me about that early on when I was trying to learn R. I actually started, went through the introductory course after I'd already been working in R and so forth. But it just really breaks it down, gives you simple tests. If you fail the test, you take the test again, and you know, so you can have it on your iPhone or whatever. You can be doing it on the train or the subway or whatever. So I highly recommend Data Camp. As an introductory, pedagogical tool.
There you go. I like data camp too. So the other question, this is a similar but slightly different uh, form of the same question. Um, Say you have somebody who is in the process of learning data science. They've been doing it. Maybe they've been doing it by themselves, and they're currently stuck and frustrated and maybe a bit discouraged, or want to throw their computer out of the window, whatever the case may be. um what do you recommend they do?
I think I think you have to tie it into your passion, and it has to be fun. And for me, it's always been about social science and solving social science problems or policy problems. So, like, I've never wanted to just be a straight data scientist. I don't even know what straight data scientists do. And, for me, it's always been about trying to solve a problem, which is basically what applied anthropologists do, whether using qualitative or quantitative methods. And if you're trying to solve a problem that really impacts other people, and it's just hard to get burnt out on it, and especially if you're doing it with other people. There's a eudaimonistic quality to the work, that is just inspirational. And so I guess that would be my recommendation is like these groups that I think there's a group called Data Science for Good. I think they even have summer internships and things like that. So check out those kind of groups, and make sure that the work ties into your social science interests and you feel like you're continuing to develop those skills.
Yeah, I really like that advice. I think in the abstract, for someone in this position, it's a good idea to go talk to someone, whether that's a group, if it's their, cousin they know who's a data scientist, or that friend that they hadn't talked to in 6 months who knows this stuff, reach out to them. If need be, reach out to me or something. I'll sort this out.
Right.
But like,
Right.
this is, I actually think for many people when they get discouraged, especially when people are learning online, it's a community that actually helps. I don't know if I would say it's a
Absolutely.
social problem, but it is a social solution.
Right.
Um, the maybe a social solution to a learning problem. Um, the
Right.
um, and one just quick side. This is a conversation for a different podcast episode, but I don't know what a pure data scientist does anymore. I'm not sure a pure data scientist exists anymore. Um, in the
Sure.
world of AI and how AI has been changing data science,
Right.
I think we're moving away from pure data scientists, but that's a conversation for a different day. Um, the
One one last thing I was thinking, I just want to mention, and we've talked about this amongst ourselves, between ourselves, that finding a community, whether it's meetup groups in New York City, there are tons of data meetup groups, and there's this thing called Beta New York City, Beta NYC, that sponsors lots of community trainings. They have this annual event called the School of Data, where people present on data science projects they're doing with Open Data New York City. So finding other communities of data scientists to get involved with is also incredibly helpful.
yeah, this makes sense. And this is especially easy to do in big cities where
Absolutely.
people tend to accumulate. Sometimes in more smaller areas, if you live in a small town, you end up having to find um you end up needing to reach out to people remotely. Um
Right.
but still,
Right.
like the big cities, these professionals organize like this. So
Right.
not just New York City, but other big cities too. Um the final question I have for you is, you've been talking about a number of your projects and other things. For anyone interested in learning more about your work, where would you recommend they go?
Good question. Mostly, I would say at this point, my LinkedIn profile. Although, to be honest with you, my LinkedIn profile is, I'm kind of in that in between stage. I haven't fully committed to putting out there in the world that I'm a data scientist. I still have a foot in the qualitative world and a couple of other worlds in my LinkedIn profile. So, um, I can almost ask you this question. I started developing a GitHub page, but haven't consistently posted there. But yeah, at this point, it would mostly be things that I'm posting about on LinkedIn, I would say. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on, um, how do you promote yourself as a data scientist, or share the work you're doing? Is it primarily, would you say, through GitHub or LinkedIn, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess overall through LinkedIn. Also, I set up my own blog or website, and I would highly recommend anyone trying to make a transition into a new field like data science to do that. It might seem daunting at first to write articles, but like when I was first looking for a job, I would do that, and I would get interviews just based purely off of that. I would have people reach out to me who read an article and then were like, hey, we have a job you might be a good fit for. But generally LinkedIn, like even those articles I would post on LinkedIn, um, or like linked to on LinkedIn is what I mean. Um, I um I have found GitHub is necessary to have, and
Mm,
it's useful within data science. But
mm,
weirdly, it's not like when you find a job, you're all actually selling to like HR and
mm.
management, who are not always going to be as in the weeds as GitHub. Um, so that's why LinkedIn is key for them. But it's LinkedIn also works with data scientists, so you get both. the technical and the non-technical with LinkedIn. I think that's why I've overall come to use it more. But both are important. Now on what you were talking about, like I'm a bit, I guess, post hyphen. So at the time we're recording this, maybe I'll change it at some point in my life. I don't know. I I think I put myself, at least for a while, I put myself on LinkedIn as anthropologist and data scientist. So I just embrace both and embrace the ambiguity that's an interesting combination for most people, that most people are just not going to get at first, and I've embraced that. So I'm in that phase. It seems like you're in the phase of still figuring out the best way to do that, which is fun. It actually took me a while. I tried multiple ways, let's just say, before I decided this one. So that's a whole process.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, no problem.